Hey everybody! So excited to have you here. Hope you're enjoying the sessions so far. And I'm gonna let people kind of just get settled here for a second, but just kind of kick things off. Just so we all are here welcoming and understanding kind of the context of this session, our breakouts are kind of intended to be a little bit more casual and more conversational. So the plan for today's talk with David and Alexis is to have them, they're going to have about a 20-minute conversation about some work that Alexis has been doing with Fully. And then they're going to open up for kind of a longer, more extended Q&A. So we'll spend a lot of time kind of just asking questions and hearing their feedback. And so that's kind of the idea. This is more just like a casual conversation for folks to kind of get an idea about the work that Fully has been doing with Construct the Present. So I will hand it off to Alexis and David. And just let them kind of dive into kind of explaining, that there isn't a one size fits all approach to this work, that they're really hoping that everyone leaves with a new idea or some sort of new perspective on how to create anti-racist workplaces. So it looks like there's lots of folks still joining us. For those of you who are just coming in, I'm just kicking it off and letting David and Alexis go ahead and go from here.
Great. Thanks, Kels. Well, I see some familiar faces in the room, so I want to say hi. And for those of you who don't yet know me, my name is Alexis Brawley-James, and I'm the founder, CEO of Construct the Present, which is a DEI consulting leadership culture company. And the name Construct the Present comes from one of my favorite quotes by Alice Walker, who is a phenomenal feminist and author, that look at the present you are constructing, it should look like the future you dream of. And that's just a quote that's always resonated with me, that I try to live, that every interaction I have, every decision I make should get me closer to the anti-racist future I want to experience. And a little bit about me personally, I identify as Black and biracial. My mom is white and my dad is Black, and I have grown up in the Portland metro area my entire life. Minus, I got to spend a phenomenal year in Washington, D.C., working at the Smithsonian, helping to curate some artifacts for the National Museum of African American History. So that is something I'm super proud of, to be a part of history. One of my first professions was as a teacher. And so history and government has been something that has been especially important. And I'll talk a little bit more about how that influences my approach to diversity, equity, inclusion. But I always think it's helpful to know the mind that birthed whatever we're talking about, so you can kind of have a little bit of context of who I am and where I'm from. And that being said, David and I are really just hoping to make the invisible visible. There's a lot of conversations about anti-racism and what it looks like, but how do you actually operationalize that? How do you move from talking about it to doing it? And so that's what we'll be talking about today. And I know David Foley's been on this continuous journey of anti-racism long before May. And I think, my friends and I were calling it the Great White Awakening, where, similar to what Dr. Alonda said, we've known about racism for a long time, and suddenly there was this wide awakening of white folks who are activated and ready to go. And I know Foley was on that journey before that happened. And I'm just curious, what is your personal commitment to anti-racism and what's influenced that?
Thanks, Alexis. And for those of you who don't know me, my name is David Kahl, and I work at Fully. I'm the CEO at Fully. And Alexis and I have been doing this work, and the history for me personally, Alexis, was, I grew up in the Deep South. I grew up in New Orleans, for those of you who don't know that I grew up in New Orleans, and New Orleans is a very Black city. New Orleans is, I think, 62% Black folks. And one afternoon after I got home from school, I brought my best friend over, Richard Ducree, my Black best friend over. And it was the first time he'd ever come to my house. And we were playing outside and we were just having a great time like 6-year-old kids do. Quack, which is what I called him because his last name is Ducree, stayed over for dinner. And then when he left, my grandfather came up to me and he said, David, you know, white folks play with white folks and black folks play with black folks. And I think like all of us, we have that sort of first memory of racism that happens to us. And that was when everything sort of changed for me. I mean, the purity that I had around color and race was gone forever. And it took a long time to just, imagine a kid just sort of sitting there trying to get their arms around. I mean, this guy's my best friend. I love him. We play, we have fun, we laugh. Why can't he come to my house? So that was the first part for me, and it stuck really deeply. And Quack and I were friends for a long time. We went to college together, and then we sort of lost touch of each other after college, like that happens sometimes. About 5 years ago, one of my friends, maybe about 4 years ago, texted me and said, "Hey, Richard died. Remember Quack from school? He died." And it just really hit me hard. And I think right around that time, I don't know if it's that week or that around, it was, I think it was probably 2017, 2018 was when Stephon Clark was murdered in Sacramento. A black man, if you don't remember, who was murdered in the backyard of his grandmother's house in Sacramento. And that's when I think the awakening started to happen. I was already an owner at Foley, and I thought, wow, our lives have just gone in such different directions since we left high school, and just got me thinking about power and privilege that I have. And so at that time, we had very few BIPOC people in Foley. I think it was less than 10% or less than 5%. And I started the realization that people in power have got to start doing something about giving more opportunities and shifting the power away. And so, partly it was my own personal experience and the fact that our company is called Foley, and we're about making sure that people can show up the way they are all the time, and they're afforded opportunities. That's really, really important. So I had met Alexis before. She had been doing some really great trainings and within Foley on when new managers get hired and making sure they understand and are equipped on how to manage other people. And we had started having conversations about what we might be able to do internally to build a real anti-racist company. And that's how we sort of started on the groundwork of the plan we put together for Foley. So, that's my perspective, Alexis, but I know that you're certainly coming at all of this from a really different place as a Black woman. And I was curious as to sort of how the work we're doing and where we find ourselves in this moment makes you feel right now.
Yeah, thank you. And I love hearing your story because it is very much in alignment, I think, with many people's stories. And there's definitely some synergy for me. I think growing up in the Beaverton area, I was always the only Black person or one of very few. And so my people ended up being other biracial kids and the Latinx community. But I always felt othered. Oftentimes, teachers would put me into lower level classes and I would have to advocate really hard to be put into AP courses. And I ended up graduating high school early. And I remember my teacher said, "So now where are you going to work?" And that may seem like really subtle, but she wasn't offering me an opportunity to go to college. She wasn't suggesting that college was for me. And so it's always been this sort of awareness simultaneously of wanting to be so much part of the community here in Portland, but always feeling otherized. And I remember when Trayvon Martin was murdered, and I was teaching at that time, and I just was certain it was going to be different. Like a teenage boy walking in his neighborhood, going to the corner store, gets murdered by a neighbor. And I thought that would be the change. And I've been continuously disappointed by both the United States and in a lot of ways by Oregon. And when Ahmaud Arbery, that was the moment that this year really triggered for me, because we're in the middle of a pandemic and here's another Black man trying to get his fitness on, going for a run in his neighborhood after being quarantined, and is murdered again by strangers. And was shocked, and I felt it so deeply in my body. And I couldn't be hopeful because I remembered feeling hope in 2016. And then when the video was released of George Floyd and I was receiving text messages and emails, people asking me how I'm doing, that's when I started to feel like it was different. And that's where I started to feel hope. Because I love my city. I feel so connected to Portland, and I've intentionally stayed here when all my friends were like, why do you stay in Portland? Come to New York, come to LA. And I'm like, no, it's gonna be different. I'm gonna be different. I'm gonna help it be different. And so I continue to hear stories of intentional and unintentional racism. And prior to May, there was still just this conversation of, well, there's no time to focus on DEI work. There's no prioritization. We need to address this. We have to do that. And then professionally, I just felt like I had been spending so much of my work with the most vulnerable communities teaching. And so many stories like Dr. Alonda shared around Black and Brown students being asked to go home or suspended for minor infractions, like not having a pencil, for wandering the halls, for being late to class. And then I wanted to find, well, where is the root cause? What's the impact that I can make? And I tried to go further up the pipeline. Like, let's think about the workplace. Like, when my kids graduate from high school, how can I support them coming into a workplace where they feel like they can bring their entire selves? And that's kind of where I sat on that day and thinking, like, this is the time, if not now, when? And so now, like, doubling down on investing my time and energy into supporting workplaces and being inclusive and really eliminating the barriers to inclusion. I think it's just been, every day is a struggle. And I think it's a struggle for a lot of reasons, but in particular being Black, it's like every day I wake up and I think of just what's one difference I want to make today. How will today be better than yesterday? And what role can I play in that?
Wow.
I think about some of our early interactions, because we did know each other long before this, and I had done training that had nothing to do with race, that was about leadership, that was about management. And I really appreciated being able to show up as an expert on something other than race. But I also remember when we started having conversations about like me taking on DEI work at Foley. And I remember I was so nervous, and we didn't know each other very well then. And I think my nervousness was just historical trauma. Like, you're this super powerful, smart white guy with glasses, and you wouldn't know that you were so committed to anti-racism. And it was like a little bit scary. Like, what am I getting into? Is he actually going to walk his talk, or is this just a box that we're trying to check? And I just loved how you let me express my anxiety and my fear, and just sort of were like, okay, we're doing this. I'm going to show up. I'm going to stand, walk my talk, stand behind my words. But on that sort of, what were the initial steps and process that you went through at Foley, and kind of as David as a person, but as David as the CEO?
You know, looking back, it seems so long ago when the protests started to really happen after the George Floyd murder, but it really wasn't that long ago. And I think for me personally, as the CEO of a company where all this is happening, you know, it's easier to lead when you're able to see people eye to eye and you're able to be close to them. I think the pandemic just made things a lot harder, that we were all separated when all this was going down. So we had to sort of throw out the playbook on how we can support the team, listen to the team. And so for me, it was just making sure that we were in communication with the team, that our supervisors were making sure that people were okay, that they felt okay, especially the Black members of our team. We called an all hands meeting. We also called an all hands meeting after the election last year, but this was a different kinds of all hands meeting because we had to be remote, and it felt different. And we gave people the opportunity to share with how they're feeling. And so I think setting up this container of people being able to share their experiences, because we were all experiencing all the feels from all these different life experiences, and some of us as Black folks, some of us as privileged white folks, some of us as people who have actually been victims of police violence before that were watching this and watching the uprising. So I think trying to build a container of support and stabilize our team was the most important thing. But certainly wanting to know that we have to do something long term. Protesting is a way that we can express our views and try to affect change as well. But I really was trying to focus on what can we do to get lasting change in this community, in this world, and knowing that it starts with this company, and to make sure that we can do everything possible to make sure fully, at least the home that we live in, the place that we work, can be as anti-racist as we possibly can make it. And if we have parts of white supremacy culture, which we do in our organization, we need to get those out of the closet and look at them square in the eye and address them. And where to start? How do you do that? There's no playbook for this stuff. So being able to partner with Alexis, talk with her just vulnerably on what do we do? How can we do this together? I think we came up with a pretty good long-term plan with how we get from this place that doesn't even know how racist it is to a place where everybody feels like they're welcome here and they can be who they truly are all the time. So I'd love for, if you're open to it, Alexis, maybe just share with the group the game plan we came up with. And we're certainly still in the game plan, and we're making we're learning as we go, and making some adjustments, but I guess kind of the overview of the game plan we laid out.
Yeah, I'm really proud of what we created. And I think some key decisions that helped create it was having you on the team. It was so important to have you as CEO in the planning meetings and be a part of every decision made so that we wouldn't have to stall the process. And so what we've come up with is this three-pronged approach. And that is creating an internal team that will drive the work. And that's really with an eye towards sustainability. And I remember we've had so many conversations of, do we call it an initiative? Do we call it a strategic plan? Do we call it a process? And we really just call it the work, because it's never ending, it's ongoing, and it's not going to stop. And so we needed that team who could hold it and take it as far as it needed to go. And then our second prong is really affinity groups, or what some people call employee resource groups. And so we've identified those, and each member of, this is a placeholder name, but our Jedi team sits on an affinity group as a facilitator. So there's really clear synergy that comes from the affinity groups, what's coming up there, and seeds the plan for the Jedi team. And then we're doing all staff anti-racism training 101, 201, and 301. And that's really about the consciousness raising, getting every single member clear on the history of race and racism, how it shows up at work, and how we're going to interrupt it. And then I guess it's a four-pronged approach, actually. And then we're also reviewing all of the processes and revising HR processes and policies through an anti-racist lens. And so we're 2-3 months in, and our Jedi team meets every month for 2 hours. We had a 4-hour kickoff initially just to really do some grounding. And what do you think, what are the big learnings so far after having spent 3 months together through this process?
I've learned a lot for sure, and I think that I feel like our team has learned a lot as well. To add a little more flavor to what Alexis outlined as well, what we're calling the Jedi team for now, and there's a lot of discussions about whether or not Jedi is the right term for this, because it does have Star Wars implications and there's racism in Star Wars. So we'll just call it our steering committee for now. How many should be on the steering committee? So we came up with about 10% of our workforce is on the steering committee, and they had to apply to be on that steering committee. And I'm very proud of our company. We had so many applications, had people telling us why do they want to be on the Jedi team and why it was important to them as well. So I just wanted to add that little bit of information in there. But yes, there's been a lot of struggle. Yes, it's been hard. And I think I didn't really know what to expect when you start to let go of power as the founder and CEO of a company and start putting people from your company, from all walks of life. There's, I think, 7 out of the 10 of our team is BIPOC. and they got priority to be on the Jedi team first, giving them the power to really call you out on things that you didn't even know were happening, I think is sometimes really difficult to hear. And so I think having a really open mind and sitting down and listening and realizing there's a lot of blind spots that are happening has been a difficult thing to do, but something that is so necessary that we lean into these things that other people see are wrong with the company and hearing that and doing something about it. And we had a great session yesterday where I heard a lot about things. Certainly, I think there's all of us that want change to happen fast. We see injustice and we're B Corps. We want to make things right. We want to do the right thing. We want to use the power of our business to make a difference. And I think certainly the people who work at companies like Fully and other B Corps tend to be very progressively minded, and we want change to happen soon. And I think this has been one of the difficulties, knowing that change happens slowly. With radical change can't really happen fast. And so we need to go, and Alexis has a wonderful phrase that she has taught me, that we need to go at the speed of trust. We need to learn to trust one another on this process. We need to learn to trust that we all are coming at this from different perspectives and we all want to do the right thing. And there's nobody in the room smarter than all of us in the room. And so being able to bring all of that together was something that was really great. And I think just some logistical things on, because we have such an engaged team at Fully, just the scheduling of all of the meetings that we're going to have has been difficult, because sometimes our customer service team isn't able to answer the phones for several hours in a row, and that's not good for business. It's not good for our customers, but it's good for our purpose and it's good for what we're trying to do. So balancing those things out. And I think another thing would be, as we all know, getting into these kinds of deep, vulnerable conversations can put us in a really tender place around our hearts, and we're talking about things that are really vulnerable, and there's crying and there's a lot of emotions happening, and we're trying to hold one another. And then shifting back into work after that has been challenging, coming from these spaces where we're talking about racism and our experience with it and how we want to do better, and then answering a phone call from our customer because they haven't gotten their desk yet. Really helps us put things in perspective on what's really, really important. So we're trying to schedule those meetings maybe a little bit at the end or the beginning of the day, so we can, we don't have to do those kind of difficult shifts between the work we're doing to make ourselves an anti-racist company and the work the company is doing to bring height adjustable desks to the world too.
Yeah.
Oh, that's been hard. And I don't know for you too, Alexis. I mean, there's been things that have been hard, unexpected. How about things you might have learned or not expected?
Well, I think that speed of trust is so important, because I think there was a lot of urgency initially, which rightfully so. We should be urgent. This work is life and death. And there's so much historical trauma in all of us. Racism traumatizes everyone. And how do you sort of have these conversations in a trusting, caring, loving way so that action can come from it? Because it's really hard to make change from a hurt place. Like there's that quote, hurt people, heal people. And so a lot of this process is a process of healing that historical trauma. And in order to do that, we have to sometimes go slow to go fast. And what I really love is I've seen Fully as a group sort of take the time and then be able to make quick decisions because the trust is there. And so I think the biggest thing I've learned through it is it just continues to be healing for me and what's possible after, being let down so many times by different experiences. Seeing it unfold at Fully has been like reinvigorating. It's something I look forward to all week, all month. Time passes different in COVID, but just the connection and the energy that your team brings, it's really inspiring.
Awesome. There's some really good questions coming in. So maybe I'll throw a question in if that's all right with y'all. So from Katie, this question is for Alexis. How can hiring managers communicate anti-racist commitments? What are tangible steps, such as employees to submit applications without hesitation, knowing that reaching out the right talent pools is the first step?
You cut out a tiny bit, so I
Oh,
missed.
no. Okay.
That's okay. I think I got
It's a
what
question about, so hiring managers, how can they communicate anti-racist commitments and what tangible steps, such as ways to encourage potential employees to submit applications without hesitation, knowing that reaching the right talent pools is the first step.
Okay, so it sounds partially internal and external, or is the question about how do you recruit a more diverse workforce?
Katie, would you want to clarify your question? Feel
Yeah,
free to
thanks, team.
hop
I
on.
want to make sure I'm addressing it.
I appreciate that, Alexis. Yeah, I was just curious, as you were talking about your story, right, and applying to Fully and walking in, and there's David, right, and just what that all looks like. And so ways that whether it's hiring managers or for small teams like us, the whoever's stepping into that role, how can we communicate? You're welcome here.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think one thing that oftentimes gets taken for granted in the hiring process is rapport building. I think that oftentimes recruiters and people looking for employees only think about, well, I have the power, I need to make sure this person's a good fit, rather than sort of turning that on its head and thinking like, I need to make sure this person understands what they're getting into. I want to build relationships so they know and can make a better decision. And I think that's something that David and Maria, who also works at Fully, did, is like they really spent time sharing about themselves, which then invited me to share about myself. So it wasn't the onus was on me to build the relationship and bare my soul, but they modeled that for me. And so then it felt comfortable, and I got to see a little bit like, okay, you're not just saying that this is an inclusive workforce, you're doing this. Because I think too much the focus is on what do I need to say, but it's action has to come from that.
Awesome. So we also had another question from Wendy. Wendy would love to hear more about the content of the anti-racism 201 and 301. Are you able to share?
Yeah, I can share with you some big ideas. So we're talking a lot about how to interrupt bias at work and how do you leverage the skills that you learn to be able to amplify voices that are historically marginalized. So some of that is role playing, some of that is practicing responding to microaggressions, defining what a microaggression is, and then practicing how to reframe it. Something that I've been really cognizant over the last few months is language. And there's so many colloquialisms in our language that are steeped in racism. I was just talking about this earlier, like calling a spade, or using powwow when you mean huddle, and really sort of outlining, here's all the things that we don't say, here's how to respond to them when you hear them. And then honestly, the 301 is not defined yet. We'll have to see what we experience when we get there, because it'll be about filling in the gaps and ensuring that we're always meeting at people's learning edge.
Alexis. So there was a question about how many people are on Fully's team. And Jen jumped in and answered that for us. So there's 130 folks. Oliver would like to know, how can we scale these actions from bigger to smaller teams? In Oliver's case, they only have 9.
Yeah, David and I were talking about this, and actually Anna Medill, who's here from Avenue Agency, I've been working with them, who has a bit smaller team. And like we said in the beginning, it's not cookie cutter, but I think really thinking about what we're doing with the affinity groups, I've seen models where companies create a community together. So maybe 3 corporations or 3 companies share those affinity groups so that there's synergy, and all the white folks meet together, the people of color, the LGBTQ community. Because I think what we have to do in this work is stop being isolated and really come together for collective consciousness. So that's what I would suggest for the affinity groups. For a steering committee, a team of 9, that's just your team. You spend, 2 hours a month really talking about your policies, practices, and doing learning. And then as far as the training, either attending training together or bringing someone in to deliver training to your group. But that's also something you could do collectively if you wanted to partner with 2 other organizations and say, hey, we want to bring this trainer in for 4 hours. You're invited. Let's do that. I don't think you have to, nor should you do it alone. For larger companies, I've seen more of an organic model where different departments kind of take on different roles, and then there's a larger steering committee. That would be a much longer explanation. So feel free to email me and we could have that conversation offline if you're one of those companies that is like over 250.
Thanks, Alexis. Would you mind actually putting your email in the chat in case people would like to reach out to you?
While Alexis is doing that, I'll just tell folks that we also empowered our team to define the kind of affinity groups they wanted. So, we have a BIPOC affinity group, we have a white allies affinity group, we have an LGBTQI affinity group, we have a gender nonconforming affinity group, and we got some requests for other affinity groups, like a neurodiverse affinity group. So I think it was important for us as a company to give our employees the opportunity to tell us how they identify so that we could create those opportunities for conversation within those safe spaces and seed those groups with Jedi members that could bring a lot of those conversations up to the Jedi team so that we could be informed on where we need to go as a company.
Mm-hmm. And I think it's really important. We trained all of the affinity group leaders so that they would have basic facilitation skills. Because what I've seen is a lot of harm can be done when you are just picking someone and say, hey, you're Black, you lead the Black affinity group, without any kind of skill, experience, or compensation. And all of this we do on company time. No one is asked to do this off hours or during time that they're not compensated for.
Great, that's a good point. We have a question. Oh, did you have something?
Yeah, I was just going to say,
yeah,
this
please.
is maybe one of the things that we were kind of alluding to earlier about for those B Corps that either haven't started like the longer term work yet is know that it's going to be an investment in time, an investment in resources, and making sure that the CEO or the president is really involved in it and bought into it, because the work takes a lot of time, and it's not expensive. It's not inexpensive from a dollar perspective or an employee bandwidth perspective. So definitely going in with eyes wide open that this is going to take time, it's going to be expensive, and it's going to be uncomfortable. And you're probably going to hear things that are going to make you feel some shame or some emotions that maybe aren't so pleasant. And knowing that that's on the horizon and leaning into it, I think is also something that will help better prepare you to be productive.
That actually brings up a follow-up question just for me. I'm just going to interject since it so fits right into this, what you're saying, David. What if you are working for a company, let's say, who has a leader who is not yet bought into this experience? Do you have any advice for employees that might want to try to convince their leadership that this is an important thing to do, an important work to be done?
I think the employers are the right people that need to do the convincing if the CEO or the owner's not there yet. I mean, I think we as B Corps want to be about something. Employees of B Corps want to work at places that they know are using our incredible power of capitalism for good. So I think it's up to all of us to convince that's a lobbying thing that I do a lot with my fellow CEOs as well, asking them, hey, what are you doing along this? Let's compare notes. What's working for you? What's not working for you? So if you're at this president or CEO or founder level, holding your colleagues accountable on what's happening there, I think is really important. But I think from an employee standpoint, I know that I got several emails right after the George Floyd murder, like, what are we going to do? What are you going to do? Because it's up to all of us. And so I think we need to hold each other accountable in these times.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think that's a really great place for white allyship or white accompliceness, is to do that on behalf of marginalized groups. So if you identify as heterosexual, cisgendered, or male, like, your voice should be the loudest in advocating for equity.
Absolutely. Thanks, Alexis. Okay, so we have a question from Emily around the trainings. So does does everyone go through the same progression, 101, 201, 301? Or do you somehow determine different levels of awareness coming into the work?
We talked about that and we decided that everyone was going to go through 101, 201, 301 together. And so we're doing 101 during quarter 4, 201 during quarter 1, and 301 during quarter 2. And so it's every month, 4 hours, and people are put into cohorts and we're doing it via Zoom. And the thinking behind that was, though people may have different personal experience with the content or different knowledge bases, a lot of what we're trying to share and learn is how to have these hard conversations at work. And since Foley had never done anything like that with everyone involved, there was no one who was in a better place or further along than that, because these are your current coworkers. This is the current events. This is how we talk about this today and right now.
And I think another reason besides those that Alexis already gave is doing the practice of talking about racism in our affinity groups is one thing. It's one thing to be in amongst white people and talking about racism. I think people are, in my experience, a little more vulnerable and will take some more risks into what they say. And we need to practice that, though, across our groups too. So that's one of the things that these 101, 201, and 301s do for us as a company, is they put white folks, black folks, transgender, cisgender together so that we can practice together as well through the exercises of all of these white supremacy learnings that we need to try and undo. So it's sort of a two-pronged approach for me on those 101, 201, and 301s. Yes, it's mandatory. Yes, you have to go through each one of them sequentially. And it's important that we have the opportunity to talk about these things across our affinity groups, because that's how we're going to make the change.
Mm-hmm.
Awesome. Great question from Sash. How do you manage bringing in new employees? How do you bring them up to date? And especially if you do a lot of hiring?
Well, we are developing a mentorship program, and I think part of that vision will be to pair people up with buddies who can kind of give a quick orientation. And what I've seen work in other companies is having kind of, here are a set of competencies that every employee should know, and then here's a few different ways to get those. You could read this book, you could do this, but then we'll continuously offer those. What we sometimes call fully university, but like the 101, 201 classes. And then you can join an affinity group at any time. You, Jen Pagliaro, who's in here, does the work of onboarding folks and lets them know about all the different places that we're doing the Jedi work. Is there anything you would add, David or Jen, since you just happen to be here?
This is one of those things that we're also learning along the way. We're excited about trying this mentorship program. I think it's going to be a great opportunity for us. But as we hire new people, as we get enough new people, we'll reinstate the 101, 201s, and 301s. We're fortunate enough to be growing at a pretty good pace at Foley. So I can't imagine that by the next quarter, we won't be having sort of overlapping 101, 201s, and 301s happening, depending on when you join the company.
Nice.
Great. A question from Katie. Do the Zoom cohorts stay consistent throughout the trainings, or do you mix them up along the way?
We will be mixing them up along the way. The marker we have is just by the end of quarter 1, every single employee quarter 4, every single employee will have gone through 101, which will keep us on track to be able to mix those up. And as far as like logistically behind the scenes, we use a form where people register, sign up, and then we're kind of checking that list to ensure continuity and compliance that we're, doing what we said we would do, which means 100% of Foley employees will learn these things.
Great. And we have a question from Shannon. This is a good one. How are you addressing intersectional issues within the work when those issues arise?
Well, first, we decided that we wanted to focus on anti-racism, and that's because that's a conversation that often gets pushed to the side when we talk about other identities. That being said, the affinity groups is really a place for us to address that intersectional work. So as David talked about, we have an LGBTQ affinity group, we have a neurodiverse affinity group, and they're talking about the intersection of that identity and race and racism. So what is it like to be a member of the LGBTQ community and be talking about racism? How is that different or the same as someone who wouldn't identify that way? And so that is how we're choosing to address it. And then once people share their experience, it's always acknowledged. And it's not like, no, when you come into this room, you need to forget that you're trans and only talk about race, but that we're holding space to make sure we're having the conversation about race.
And one thing I'll add to that as well is we allow people to be a part of however many affinity groups that they feel that they identify with. So if someone feels gender nonconforming and they are also BIPOC, and we even have a parents group, and they're also a parent, you can be in each of those affinity groups with your identity as well. So even though they're not intersecting into one affinity group, you can be that, you can show up as that identity that you identify with in each one of those groups, however many you want.
Mm-hmm.
Great. From Rian, what outcomes are you measuring after the 3-part trainings? What's the vision plan after the 3-part training?
That's such a good question, because oftentimes we get stuck right at the, oh, let's talk about race, but what are we going to do about race? And so that's where the HR processes and policies is coming in, is we're going to start to revisit our performance measurement and what are the questions, or how are we measuring what success looks like? How are we sort of cracking open these white supremacy ideals? And we haven't put any specific KPIs yet, because we want to make sure that those KPIs come from an anti-racist mind. Because oftentimes when you move too quickly to what are we measuring without having that new awareness, you'll just reproduce the same white supremacist situations. I've seen that happen, like thinking about and not to put the city on blast, but the COVID process, right? That's a process that's meant to amplify and elevate women and people of color, but in fact, it just creates more barriers. And so wanting to be really mindful that the processes we put in place are coming from anti-racism. And so we're going to think about how has the workforce changed at the end of this process? How are we more diverse? How are we more open to conflict and disagreement? How are we more inclusive as far as connection and not siloed? So I realize they sound mushy, and that's just because we're moving at a pace that wants to be authentic.
Nothing to add. Perfect.
Awesome. Do you have, we have a question from Mike, and then it'll be the last one. Then maybe we'll give some final thoughts. I'll also have to just give folks a little bit of information here at the end about next steps. Question from Mike. Any thoughts on pulling in environmental justice concepts relative to climate and other impacts of underrepresented populations?
I'm going to let you do this one, David, because this is your, I know so much of where you source your materials and how you think about what you create is impactful on that piece.
Yeah. I appreciate the question, Mike. First, I'll just say that we're focusing this initiative on anti-racism. We just went through a strategic retreat with our senior leadership team where we came up with our strategic goals for the next year to 18 months. And we laid out all those strategic objectives, one of which is to continue to have less of an environmental impact. It's included within one of those, but then we're laying the Jedi anti-racism principles on top of all of that. And so helping us think a little bit more about, is there an intersection between our packaging or where we source our materials, and is there anything racist in those? So we're trying to sort of turn the question around and really focus on anti-racism, while at the same time being a company that's about the planet and purpose as well. So it's something that's sort of taking a backseat, but within the intersection of all of our strategic goals, we're overlaying the Jedi principles on top of that. So it's a little bit squishy as well. And I think that those two things aren't mutually exclusive. And we just need to sort of figure out and ask the questions that we haven't asked before on, hey, is our packaging racist? It's things that kind of sound questions we wouldn't have maybe been asking before. Is our raw material, or how we source our raw materials, or the materials that we use, is it inherently in some way racist? So our product development team, our supply chain team, they're all in the process right now of being tasked with how are we going to implement these 6 strategic goals over the next 12 to 18 months. So I'll let you know more on that when we do a little bit more work on it.
Awesome. Well, we're just at time, so we're going to go ahead and wrap up. Thank you so much, David, and thank you, Alexis. This has been, personally, I've really enjoyed this conversation. It's super valuable to see like what companies are actually doing. There's some really good ideas that came out of this, so I really appreciate you sharing that with us. Want to let people know that next up, we actually have a movement break sponsored by Fully. And we are going to be hearing from Doc Jen Fit, who is a physical therapist and is going to go over some stretches and things that we can do at our desks to make sure that we're treating our bodies the best way we can while we're sitting for these 2 half days enjoying this gathering. So please go back and join the main room. You can get that link on the Sked page. I will also hang out here and pop it in the chat to make sure that people have access to it. But yeah, looking forward to seeing you in the next session. And thanks again, Alexis and David. Oh, thanks, Karen. You got the webinar link. Awesome. Bye, everybody. Thank you so much.